You just saw a wonderful panel discussion about unlocking wealth from a corporate ownership structure.
I think it was a great event. We had an opportunity for a lot of business owners that don't get to speak to colleagues that deal with the same problems that they deal with behind the curtain at their companies.
I think that it's important to provide good education for the business owner, entrepreneur, CEO community from professionals who have done it and who have worked with owners who face the same issues that those owners are facing every day. Welcome. I'm Jonathan Penta, founder of Penta Wealth Management, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening for our special event focused on unlocking your company's value and successful business transition planning. We really have just a fantastic program lined up for you here this evening with an amazing panel of experts. Each of the panelists you'll hear from this evening are truly leaders in their areas of practice with proven track records helping owners in transition. I'm just honored to join them on the panel this evening, and I want to thank each of them for being part of our event this evening. Before we jump into our panel discussion, I'd just like to share a quick story about a client of ours that I think really illustrates why we're here this evening and how careful planning can really lead to a highly successful business transition. So let me tell you about my client who's currently retired, former CEO of a technology company. A little over 4 years ago, this client started doing some serious thinking about selling his company, but at the time, he didn't really know what the company was even worth or what it would need to sell for to meet his long-term financial goals. At the same time, he also didn't know if he should sell at that time or if he should wait and hopefully grow the business to be worth more down the road. Now, when we did a comprehensive business valuation actually came back less than what the owner thought the company might have been worth. Pretty common for business owners. At the same time, we did an analysis of all my clients' financial goals, including gifting to children, charitable inclinations, spending in retirement, buying a vacation home. And when we modeled all of those goals into our planning system and assessed the impact, really the impact of selling his company at that valuation on his ability to meet those goals, we identified that there was a wealth gap. So my client is then faced with this decision really to either reduce his financial goals and aspirations or take steps toward increasing the value of the business. Now, since we were able to identify some key value drivers that could be improved upon, my client decided to take steps toward growing the business. And over the next 3 years, we implemented some value enhancement strategies where we were able to actually increase the value of the company by over 30%. And about a year ago, he sold that business for just north of $60 million. Now, not only is he happy with the price he was able to sell the business for, but more important, he was able to meet all of his financial goals for him and his family, including setting up a charitable foundation, buying that vacation home, gifting to his children through tax shelter gifting strategies, and is now living really a dream retirement.
And another way that we look at that, because the pandemic and all of this has kind of messed up how many different banks and investors and buyers think about companies, what people are starting to do now is say, as things normalize a little bit, how do the companies look today in their performance, their growth trajectory, and so forth, relative to what they looked like before the pandemic? So looking back, comparing the performance to 2019. And, I think if you look at it, Q1 was right about flat to the performance that we saw in 2019. Which at that point in time was right around, bumping against the ceiling of all-time highs. And Q2 looks to be between that level and where we saw a high in the middle of 2022. So I think that's a good sign for things to turn around. We did see, and one of the things I think is driving this, in the last 18 months, there's been sort of far fewer transactions being done by private equity firms. I think they had been running rampant for, 6 to 8 quarters. And they've been focused on integrating a lot of those acquisitions. Higher interest rates made it a little tougher to get deals done, and they pushed values down a little bit too, so they weren't selling. But we saw that volume increase by about 30% in Q2 over a year ago, Q2, in terms of private equity activity, which I think is a good sign. The banking market is still quite tricky. High rates make it expensive to borrow for leverage lending, but a lot of banks just simply are a little overcautious and not lending into the M&A markets. That's also contributed to the slow time. But I think we're seeing leverage multiples and the correlated valuation multiples come back a little bit in the most recent quarter we saw valuation multiples tick up about a half a turn, despite rates still being quite high relative to the last few years. We also saw some interesting things, seller financing and earnouts, which had crept up over the last couple of years, even to some of the larger transactions. Historically, transactions under $25 million have always had a significant percentage of contingent performance in their deals, up to roughly 50%. But what we'd seen in the last 4 to 6 quarters was even deals at 50 million were well over, we were over 50% having some element of contingency, and even the deals between 50 and 250 were up approaching 50%. And the other question, Tom, that I know we talked about coming in was sort of how far in advance should people all be doing these things? And that's like the easiest question anybody could ask all night, because the answer, no matter how much you've done and where you are, is always you should have started yesterday. You can never do too much preparation. You've never heard anybody close a deal and be happy with it and say, boy, I wish I'd done less preparation. You never will hear anybody say that. Far more likely that, every person I talked to was like, oh yeah, our finance department's awesome. We're great. We're totally prepared. We got this, we got that. But at closing dinners, we ask people, okay, if you highlighted this too, Tom, if you knew then what you now know, what would you do differently? And they laugh. They'll say, my God, well, first of all, thank God we just did this. This is awesome. I'm excited. All the things I can do now. But if I'd known what I know now, I'm not sure I would have had the guts to do it. It is honestly far and away the most brutal thing. If you haven't sold a business before, stressful, anxiety, time. The points about unsolicited offers, all these things, the reason you need to do this preparation with people who do it, eat, sleep, breathe it 10 times a day is every buyer, whether they're a corporate buyer, whether they're a private equity buyer, whether they're a competitor. Honestly, if you start doing something with a family member to try and transition it to them, they're going to have advisors that are going to do this the right way. These are smart people. You're not going to slip anything by them. You can't beat the market. You can't time the market. The reason you get paid a multiple is because people are looking for the future cash flows of what you're doing, and their best approximation of that is what you've done in the past. If you try to carve all the meat off the bone, these buyers are smart. They do this for a living. They buy companies low, they sell companies high. They prefer to do them both. I think if you have somebody that can push them to pay a fair value up front, they need to see the continuing upside, or they won't pay you a high multiple. So timing the market, just forget about it. You need to prepare and be able to communicate the right value proposition to the right buyers, and it's different. You might have 6 different value propositions to different buckets of buyers. And, unless you can get them to compete against one another and compete against themselves, because they don't know whether they're the high bidder when you run through this type of we don't use the word auction, by the way, because I think people get a little anxious when they hear that, but we call it we've got a brand of, we call that done rush, 2-stage controlled sale. Sounds a little nicer, a little gentler.
The big one I'm about to mention, a lot of business owners don't fully appreciate until the deal hits them, and that's third-party contractual consents, and whether contracts that generate revenue for your business are actually assignable within the context of a deal. I can't tell you the number of clients that don't want to pay legal fees because they're not selling their company, and they're like, oh, I negotiated the contract, it's all set, no problem. And then they get to the sale 10 years later and they have 13 contracts that are unassignable. That's a big problem if you're a seller. And you've just cost yourself way more in legal fees to solve that problem than it would have cost to fix it up front. So the language of these contracts has to effectively provide for your ability to have those contracts go to a buyer. 2 other things I want to list that are on the list that I wanted to mention. Indemnification. That's a real legal word that everyone acts like they know what it means, but they don't really. Indemnification, if you're a seller, means you stand behind what you're selling and you promise to make a buyer whole for any statements, representations, or warranties you made about your business that subsequently proved to be inaccurate or untrue. You've got to make the buyer whole through the indemnification process. That's really important because that can be divided into various categories: fundamental indemnifications, general, etc. The last thing that's on this list, if this is the only thing that you take away from tonight, it will be something that you can actually quantify in terms of the value. RWI, rep, and warranty insurance. In the old days, before RWI existed, a buyer would come in and negotiate the deal, and as part of the deal, it was a given that somewhere between 10 to 15% of the purchase price was going to be set aside in an escrow to stand behind your indemnification obligations for somewhere between 12 and 24 months. So if you sold your business for $100 million, $15 million is going to sit in escrow for 18 months until that passage of time occurs and no problems have occurred from the buyer's perspective. So effectively, 15% of the deal is subject to risk for some period of negotiated time. RWI is an insurance product that has come onto the scene over the last 10 plus years, where an insurance company, a third party, will issue an insurance policy as it relates to your deal. They'll stand behind the reps and warranties that you make as a seller to the buyer, such that after it closes, if something were to occur, it's the insurance policy, for the most part, that will cover the damages to the buyer. That's in and of itself gives you peace of mind as the seller after the deal closes, that you don't have to worry about them coming back after you. But the second piece of this that is absolutely huge, instead of having to leave 10 to 15% of the purchase price in escrow, you leave 0.5% per the terms of the insurance policy. So 14 to 14.5% of the purchase price comes to you on day one and is no longer subject to risk. When you're selling your company, you should be highly encouraged by your advisors, and you should be insisting from your investment banker that RWI is part of your deal.
It's never the buyer, ultimately, that the people think it is. The people that are chasing you and calling you constantly, guarantee you they're doing that because they want to get a low price, and when you put them in the competition, sometimes they'll compete, but they won't be the high price. People are amazed because of this whole impact of synergies and savings. It's not like anything else you've done. You buy or sell a spoon at Walmart, it's this, at Target, it's a little more, a little less. If you have the kind of business that can drive 10, 15 bids in a process, the top bids will 100% of the time be double the bottom bids. It's literally a spread like that. And if you can run a competitive process and you don't, not every company can, but if you can run a competitive process and you don't, you will likely leave millions of dollars on the table.
PE recap is just a fancy name for a form of deal structure that the private equity folks like to consummate with sellers. And it includes the purchase price and then the rollover equity that I mentioned earlier. The combination of that is effectively called a PE recap or recapitalization. They're recapitalizing your company, giving you cash up front, having you roll equity. They come in as the majority owner of the new co. You stay on as a minority owner of NewCo. Couple of important points to remember as a seller as it relates to a PE recap. There are majority recaps where the buyer takes a majority position. There are minority recaps where they might take a minority position. The vast majority of the deals, they'll come in and take a majority. The second thing as a seller that you should be keenly focused on is the treatment of your rollover equity relative to the buyer's equity. Another fancy term you can use at the next cocktail party, pari passu, equal. You want your equity to effectively be on the same terms and conditions as the buyer's equity. You don't want it to be junior. You don't want it to have less rights and preferences. You want it to be pari passu. And to Greg's point, when you're negotiating multiple LOIs with multiple private equity firms, some will agree to that, some won't. And that can impact your decision as to which firm you go with. Even if there's a delta in the purchase price, if you're rolling over a significant portion of equity and it's pari passu, that could be more valuable even if you get less cash up front than if you were to take more cash up front, roll your equity, but have it be junior to the buyer's equity. The last point, why that's important, because when that company is eventually sold, if you're not pari passu or equal, depending on what the business sells for down the road, that you may not take in as much capital with that second bite at the apple if you're not equal with the private equity buyer.
Other thing to consider is whether you are going to be taking stock in the new company that's purchasing you or not. A lot of people want a cash deal for obvious reasons. I know one person in the room who should remain nameless, whose family member sold their company, wanted to get cash. They ended up getting stock instead. That stock is now 100,000% more valuable than the cash they would have received 30 years ago. So that's just, obviously that's a unique circumstance, but you want to consider that as well, because Shannon's right. The rollover equity makes a big difference.
Janice has another form of transaction that I think is important.
We've talked here about equity type of transactions. I had mentioned before when we're talking about LOIs, there's also an asset purchase. And I don't know if everyone knows the difference between those two major types of acquisition. So you have an asset purchase or you have a stock purchase. An asset purchase is somebody's coming in and buying just parts of your company. Typically, they're buying maybe not the cash, maybe not the debt, but other types of assets that are there, and they're taking those over. Typically, they're the revenue-generating type assets. That deal is set up very differently from a stock deal. And in the first situation, your company still stays as a legal entity, and you've got to unwind it, and there's all sorts of compliance issues that you need to do, tax returns and all that to unwind it. And that's a very different distinction from an equity deal, where a company is going to come in and buy 100% of your company, or, a percentage, but let's say it's 100%, and they're taking on everything, including your liabilities.
Well, I want to thank our panel for doing just a fantastic job. Really, everybody I thought did an amazing job. I want to thank Penta Wealth Management's Director of Client Service and Operations, Anthony Lima, for just doing a great job with preparing a lot of the logistics and event planning for tonight. As I'm thinking about a lot of the questions that were raised here, most of what we talked about tonight, there are articles and white papers in the event resources page that is accessible via the QR code in your packets. We were pretty careful about what to put on that resources page. So most of the topics we covered, there are articles and white papers about all of that that you can, that you have access to. You can read about and learn more. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. It was a great event, and hopefully everybody got a lot out of it. If anybody has any questions afterwards, we're available. Feel free to get in touch. And thanks everybody for coming.